year, the sky turned against the earth. Long before modern supermarkets stacked their shelves with food from across the world, cities lived and died by the harvest. Wheat, barley, oats, and rice were not just crops. They were life itself. Every loaf of bread, every bowl of porridge, every sack of grain represented survival. And when the harvest failed, hunger followed. In the early years of the 19th century, people across Europe and parts of North America began noticing something strange. The weather, once predictable and familiar, started behaving in ways no one could explain. Winters grew longer. Summers felt weak and cold. The skies stayed gray longer than usual, and the sun often looked dim, as if seen through smoke. Farmers watched their fields with growing fear. Seeds that once sprouted quickly began hesitating in the soil. Young shoots turned pale and weak. Rain fell at the wrong times, sometimes too heavily, sometimes not at all. Frost crept into the ground long after spring should have arrived. No one yet knew that far across the ocean, on an island few had ever heard of, a disaster had already begun. In April of 1815, the earth trembled violently on the island of Sumbawa in what is now Indonesia. A mountain known today as Mount Tambora erupted with a force unlike anything most humans had ever witnessed. The explosion was so powerful that it was heard more than 2,000 kilometers away. Ash and dust shot into the sky in towering columns that climbed higher than storms, higher than clouds, higher than any bird had ever flown. The sky turned black. Villages near the volcano disappeared beneath falling ash. Crops burned. Rivers filled with mud and debris. Thousands of people died in the first days alone. But the most devastating effects were not local. They were global. The eruption hurled millions of tons of volcanic ash and fine dust high into the atmosphere, where winds carried it across continents and oceans. Unlike ordinary smoke, this dust stayed suspended in the air for months and even years. It circled the planet, forming a thin veil around the earth. At first, no one in Europe or North America understood what had happened. They simply noticed that something was wrong. The year 1816 became known as the ** year, without a summer asterisk. In places like New England in the United States, snow fell in June. Frost destroyed cornfields in July. Rivers froze in August. Farmers who had never feared summer weather suddenly found their crops dying in the cold. Across the Atlantic in Europe, the situation was just as grim. Rain fell endlessly over fields in England, France, and Germany. Sunlight, weakened by dust in the upper atmosphere, could not warm the soil enough for crops to mature. Wheat failed. Potatoes rotted in wet ground. Oats refused to ripen. Food supplies began shrinking. At first, city leaders believed the problem would pass. They told citizens to remain calm. Storehouses were opened. Grain reserves were rationed. Bakers tried stretching flour supplies by making smaller loaves. But as weeks passed, hope faded. Markets grew quiet. Where baskets once overflowed with vegetables and grain, stalls began sitting empty. Bread prices doubled, then tripled. Poor families who depended on daily wages found themselves unable to afford even the simplest meals. Parents began skipping food so their children could eat. In crowded cities, hunger spreads faster than disease. Once food becomes scarce, fear follows. And once fear takes hold, order begins to break. In parts of Europe, angry crowds gathered outside bakeries, demanding bread. Some smashed windows. Others seized flour sacks by force. Governments deployed soldiers to guard grain warehouses. Starvation was no longer a distant threat. It was arriving at the gates of cities. Meanwhile, scientists of the time struggled to understand what was happening. Meteorology was still a young science. No satellites watched the skies. No global communication systems shared information across continents. All people could see were darkened sunsets and strange red skies at dawn. Artists painted these unusual skies, capturing deep oranges and glowing reds never seen before. Today, historians believe those dramatic colors were caused by volcanic dust scattering sunlight across the atmosphere. But at the time, they were seen as warnings. Some believed the world was ending. Religious leaders spoke of divine punishment. Farmers blamed curses or bad luck. Governments searched desperately for explanations. Yet beneath the confusion, one quiet truth began emerging. Cities were running out of food. As harvest after harvest failed, the grain that remained grew precious. Merchants guarded their supplies closely. Prices climbed beyond what ordinary families could pay. Bread, the most basic food of urban life, became rare. In cities like London, Paris, and Vienna, crowds lined up outside bakeries before sunrise, hopping to secure a single loaf before supplies vanished. Many left empty-handed, and hunger changes people. Children who once played in busy streets grew weak and silent. Workers fainted in factories. Beggars multiplied along roads and bridges. City leaders faced an impossible question. How do you feed thousands or millions when the fields produce nothing? At first, they turned to traditional solutions. Imports were increased wherever possible. Ships were sent across seas to gather grain from regions less affected by the strange weather. But even those regions struggled. The dust in the sky had cooled temperatures worldwide. No place escaped entirely. Some governments ordered strict rationing. Others outlawed hoarding. Inspectors searched homes and businesses for hidden grain supplies. Still, the shortages continued, and it was during this desperate time that a strange and unusual idea began to spread. An idea that would one day save entire cities from starvation. The idea was simple. If food could not be grown in fields, perhaps it could be created in other ways. People began experimenting with substitutes, materials that were not traditionally considered food. Some mixed sawdust into flour. Others ground roots, bark, and seeds into powder. Many of these attempts failed. Some produced bread that tasted bitter. Others created loaves so hard they could barely be eaten. But desperation breeds innovation, and hunger forces imagination to grow stronger than tradition. One of the most unusual discoveries came from an unexpected source. Dust. Not ordinary street dust, but a fine, mineral-rich powder found in certain regions. The kind created by ancient glaciers grinding rock into microscopic particles. In places across northern Europe, scientists and farmers began studying this strange material. It looked like gray powder, soft and dry, almost like flour. But unlike flour, it came from stone. At first, people laughed at the idea. Eating dust sounded absurd. Yet as hunger deepened and options vanished, even the strangest solutions began to feel worth trying. Researchers tested the powder, mixing it with grains, roots, and whatever small food supplies remained. To their surprise, they discovered that this mineral dust contained tiny nutrients, trace elements that plants normally pulled from soil, and more importantly, when mixed carefully with flour, it allowed bread supplies to stretch further. A sack of grain that once fed a family for 1 week could now last longer. In starving cities, that difference meant survival. Slowly, cautiously, the idea spread. What began as desperation would soon grow into a survival strategy. One that historians would later describe as one of the strangest solutions to mass starvation in human history. But in 1816, no one yet knew how important this discovery would become. All they knew was this: the sky had turned against them, the fields had failed, and time was running out. The real experiments, the dangerous ones, were about to begin. Next asterisk, Part 2, the bread riots that shook Europe. Ready when you say asterisk, Part 2, asterisk asterisk. The bread riots that shook Europe. By the time the strange, cold summers continued into a second growing season, patience across Europe had begun to wear thin. Hunger is never quiet for long. It begins as discomfort, grows into worry, and then transforms into anger. And anger, when shared by thousands of hungry people, becomes dangerous. In the cities, food had always arrived from distant fields. Farmers harvested grain, merchants transported it along rivers and roads, and bakers turned it into bread, the foundation of daily life. For generations, this system had worked with reliable precision. Now it was collapsing. The year without a summer had already destroyed harvests across large parts of Europe and North America. Fields that should have been golden with wheat stood thin and patchy. Potatoes rotted underground. Barley and oats failed to ripen. Each failed harvest created another wave of fear, and by late 1816, that fear began spilling into the streets. In the city of London, long lines formed outside bakeries before sunrise. Workers arrived in darkness, hopping to purchase bread before supplies ran out. Many waited hours, only to watch the last loaf disappear into someone else's hands. The price of bread rose almost daily. For wealthy families, this was an inconvenience. For laborers, it was a crisis. Bread was not a luxury. It was breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Without bread, there was nothing. As the weeks passed, tempers flared. Fights broke out in markets. People accused merchants of hoarding supplies to raise prices. Some believed governments were hiding food, while ordinary citizens starved. Rumors spread faster than truth. A single whisper that a warehouse held hidden grain could draw hundreds of desperate people within minutes. Doors were pounded. Windows shattered. Guards struggled to control the crowds. Soon riots began. In parts of Paris, angry citizens stormed bakeries, demanding fair prices. They carried sticks, tools, and whatever they could find. Soldiers were ordered into the streets to protect food supplies. But soldiers, too, needed food, and many sympathized with the starving crowds. Across Germany, in towns along the Rhine River, merchants began traveling under armed escort. Grain shipments became targets. Wagons loaded with flour risked being seized before reaching their destinations. Even small villages felt the pressure. Parents watched their children grow thinner. Workers became weaker each day. Factories slowed as laborers lacked the strength to continue. Hunger changed daily life in quiet ways. Families stretched their meals. Soup became thinner. Bread loaves became smaller. Meat disappeared entirely from many tables. Instead, people turned to whatever substitutes they could find. Ground acorns were mixed into flour. Peas, beans, and roots were crushed into powder. Even dried grass and leaves were sometimes added to dough in desperate attempts to create something edible. The results were often grim. Bread made from substitutes was heavy and bitter. Some loaves caused stomach pain. Others offered so little nutrition that hunger returned almost immediately. Still, people ate them because the alternative was worse. In the countryside, farmers faced their own nightmare. They had always depended on harvests to survive the winter. But now, their barns stood nearly empty. Many sold their animals to buy grain, only to watch prices rise beyond reach. Some abandoned their farms entirely. Families packed what little they owned and began walking toward cities, believing urban centers might offer relief. Instead, they found crowds already struggling to survive. Cities swelled with newcomers. Shelters overflowed. Streets grew crowded. Beggars filled public squares. Governments struggled to maintain order as desperation spread. Meanwhile, scientists and natural philosophers, the early researchers of the time, searched for explanations. Reports of strange weather arrived from distant regions. In the Swiss Alps, glaciers advanced further down mountains than they had in decades. In parts of North America, lakes froze in summer months. In Ireland, constant rain destroyed potato crops. It became clear that this was not a local disaster. It was global. Slowly, reports began circulating about a massive volcanic eruption in the east, one powerful enough to send ash around the world. Though communication was slow, sailors and traders carried stories of darkened skies and falling ash from distant lands. The name of the volcano, Mount Tambora, became whispered among scholars, but for ordinary citizens, explanations mattered little. They needed food. In parts of Switzerland, conditions became especially severe. The mountainous terrain made farming difficult even in good years. With the cold summer destroying crops, starvation loomed quickly. Villages faced a choice: find new food sources or perish. Local leaders began encouraging experimentation. Bakers were instructed to stretch flour supplies as far as possible. Chemists, a new profession at the time, were asked to analyze unusual materials that might substitute for traditional ingredients. It was during this desperate search that attention turned toward substances normally ignored. Not plants, not animals, but minerals. In certain regions, fine gray powder covered the ground, a leftover from ancient glaciers that had once carved valleys through the landscape. This powder, sometimes called rock flour, had been noticed before, but never considered useful as food. Now it gained attention. Scientists collected samples and examined them closely. Under magnification, the powder appeared as tiny fragments of stone, ground so finely by glaciers that it resembled flour. At first glance, it seemed useless. Stone could not nourish humans. Or could it? Early chemical experiments revealed something surprising. The powder contained trace minerals, elements such as calcium, magnesium, and iron, nutrients essential for both plant growth and human health. But minerals alone could not feed people. Still, researchers wondered whether mixing this dust into bread might stretch limited flour supplies without making loaves entirely inedible. The first experiments were cautious. Small batches were prepared in local bakeries. Bakers mixed ordinary flour with small amounts of mineral powder, kneading the mixture into dough. The loaves were baked and allowed to cool. The results were mixed. Some loaves crumbled easily. Others had strange textures. But most importantly, they remained edible. And in times of starvation, edible meant valuable. Word spread quietly among scientists and city officials. If flour supplies could be extended, even slightly, entire communities might survive. until harvest conditions improved. But convincing the public would not be easy. Already, trust in authorities had weakened. Many believed officials had failed to protect food supplies. Asking citizens to eat bread mixed with dust seemed almost insulting. Yet desperation has a way of changing minds. Meanwhile, riots continued. In towns across Germany, angry mobs seized wagons carrying grain. In rural areas, farmers guarded their remaining supplies day and night. Some communities built makeshift barricades to protect food storage buildings. Governments tightened control. Rationing laws became stricter. Penalties for hoarding grew harsher. Soldiers guarded mills and bakeries around the clock. Still, hunger spread. Children became the most visible victims. Doctors reported increasing cases of weakness and illness caused by poor nutrition. Schools closed as families struggled simply to survive. Every day, without reliable food, brought cities closer to disaster. And yet, within laboratories and bakeries, strange new experiments continued. What began as a desperate idea, mixing mineral dust into food, was slowly transforming into a structured effort. Chemists measured proportions carefully. Bakers adjusted recipes. Officials recorded results. If successful, this method could buy time. Time until the skies cleared. Time until the harvest returned. Time until cities could breathe again. But failure carried risks. Too much dust could make bread dangerous. Too little would not extend supplies enough to matter. Finding the correct balance required patience. Something starving populations had very little of. Still, the work continued, because the alternative, doing nothing, meant watching cities collapse into famine. And famine, once begun, is difficult to stop. By the winter that followed, hunger had already reshaped societies. Riots had shaken governments. Families had abandoned homes. Entire regions faced the possibility of mass starvation. Yet deep within workshops and kitchens, the first truly workable recipes were taking shape. Recipes that would soon change survival itself. The age of experimental bread had begun, and soon the world would discover just how far humans were willing to go to stay alive. The scientists who turned stone into survival, while riots shook city streets and hunger spread through crowded neighborhoods. A quieter battle was unfolding behind closed doors. In workshops, laboratories, and bakeries across Europe, scientists and craftsmen worked together in ways that had rarely happened before. The goal was simple to say, but incredibly difficult to achieve. Make food last longer than nature allowed. In places where crops had failed repeatedly, traditional methods were no longer enough. Storing grain carefully, rationing bread, and importing food from distant lands could slow starvation. But they could not stop it. Something new had to be created. Among the regions hardest hit by the strange cold years was Switzerland. Its mountainous landscape meant farmland was limited even in good seasons. With harvests failing, communities found themselves dangerously close to famine. Local officials turned to educated men known at the time as natural philosophers. Early scientists who studied chemistry, minerals, and agriculture. One of the questions they began asking sounded strange even to them. What exactly makes food nourishing? For centuries, people believed food provided strength simply because it filled the stomach. But by the early 19th century, chemistry was beginning to reveal deeper truths. Scientists had discovered that certain elements, tiny invisible substances, played important roles in health and plant growth. These elements included calcium, iron, potassium, and magnesium, minerals normally found in soil. Plants absorbed them through their roots. Humans absorbed them through food. And this discovery sparked a bold idea. If soil contained the minerals needed for life, and glaciers had once crushed mountains into powder, perhaps those powders still held useful nutrients. Across the valleys of Switzerland and nearby regions, gray deposits of extremely fine dust covered certain areas. Locals sometimes called it rock flour because of its powdery texture. It had formed thousands of years earlier when massive glaciers moved slowly across the land, grinding stone into microscopic particles. When the ice melted, the powder remained behind. For generations, this material had been ignored. Now, scientists began collecting it. Small sacks of gray powder were brought into laboratories. Using simple chemical tests available at the time, researchers heated samples, dissolved portions in liquids, and studied the results. What they discovered surprised them. The dust was not empty. It contained trace minerals, tiny quantities of substances known to support both plant and human life. The amounts were small, but in times of starvation, even small advantages mattered. Still, there was a major problem. Stone cannot be digested like grain. No matter how finely ground, mineral powder alone could not replace flour. Humans lacked the ability to extract calories from rock. Without calories, survival was impossible. But scientists were not trying to replace food entirely. They were trying to stretch it. Imagine a baker with only one sack of flour left, responsible for feeding an entire neighborhood. Normally, that flour might produce a fixed number of loaves, perhaps enough for a few days. But if some harmless substance could be mixed into the flour, increasing volume without ruining the dough, the same sack might produce twice as many loaves. Each loaf would contain less flour, but more people would receive at least some nourishment. This was the principle behind the experiments, and it was dangerous. The wrong substances could poison people. Others might damage teeth or cause internal injuries. Careful testing became essential. Scientists began working closely with bakers, who understood dough better than anyone. Together, they experimented with tiny additions of mineral dust mixed into flour. At first, results were disappointing. The earliest loaves were heavy and dense. Some crumbled apart before cooling. Others developed unpleasant flavors that made them difficult to swallow. But the teams continued, adjusting their methods. They sifted the dust to remove larger particles. They mixed it with different grains, wheat, rye, and barley, searching for combinations that produced stable dough. Slowly, improvements appeared. One method involved mixing only very small amounts of dust into flour, less than 1 part in 10. This allowed bread to maintain its structure while slightly increasing total volume. Another method involved combining mineral dust with plant fibers, crushed roots, or dried leaves, creating a blend that added both bulk and trace nutrients. These experiments required patience. Every batch of bread became a test. Bakers recorded how dough behaved while kneading. Scientists measured moisture levels. Observers tasted finished loaves and noted reactions. Some loaves caused mild stomach discomfort. Others passed testing successfully. Gradually, knowledge accumulated. In nearby regions of Germany, similar experiments were taking place. Universities and workshops began sharing findings through handwritten letters, carried slowly between cities. Communication was slow, but cooperation grew. In an age before modern laboratories, even simple experiments required careful observation. Heating ovens to consistent temperatures was difficult. Measuring ingredients precisely was challenging. Yet hunger drove persistence. Across Europe, the search for alternative food sources expanded beyond mineral dust alone. In parts of France, chemists experimented with extracting starch from unusual plants. Some attempted to produce edible substances from mosses and lichens, organisms known to survive harsh climates. In Scandinavia, people had long traditions of grinding tree bark into flour during famine years. Pine bark, when dried and powdered, could be mixed into bread dough to stretch supplies. These practices were not new, but now they were being studied scientifically rather than used blindly. The merging of tradition and science created powerful results. Back in Switzerland, one group of researchers made an important discovery while analyzing local rock flour samples. They found that the mineral content varied depending on the type of stone from which the dust originated. Powder from limestone-rich regions contained higher calcium levels. Dust from granite areas carried different trace elements. This meant not all dust was equal. Choosing the right type mattered. Soon, regional maps were created identifying deposits of the most suitable mineral powders. Communities began collecting supplies carefully, ensuring the material was clean and finely ground. But another challenge remained: public acceptance. Even if the bread worked scientifically, people needed to trust it. Convincing hungry citizens to eat bread mixed with powdered stone was not easy. Rumors spread quickly in starving populations. Some claimed the dust would poison children. Others feared it was a trick by authorities to hide shortages. To address these fears, officials organized public demonstrations. Bakers prepared loaves in front of crowds, showing each step openly. Scientists explained their methods, describing how small amounts of dust could extend flour without harming health. Some volunteers tasted the bread publicly, offering reassurance. These moments were crucial. Trust, once lost, is difficult to rebuild, especially during crisis. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, in parts of the United States, communities faced similar challenges. In regions such as Vermont and New Hampshire, cold summers had damaged crops severely. Farmers experimented with alternative grains and substitute ingredients. Though mineral dust experiments remained less widespread there at the time, back in Europe, progress continued. Some of the most successful bread formulas combined three elements: traditional flour, plant-based fillers, finely sifted mineral dust. Together, they produced loaves that were not ideal, but were survivable. And survival was the goal. By late winter, word of these experimental breads began spreading more widely. Governments started collecting data from different cities, comparing results and adjusting guidelines. New regulations encouraged careful use of substitute ingredients, ensuring that mixtures remained safe for consumption. Gradually, the strange idea of eating dust transformed from rumor into policy. What had once sounded absurd was becoming an organized survival strategy. And though hunger still haunted the streets, something else began appearing alongside it. Hope, not hope for comfort or abundance, but hope for endurance. Hope that cities might survive until warmer seasons returned. Hope that science, combined with desperation, might outlast disaster. Yet challenges remained ahead, because producing experimental bread was only the beginning. Distributing it fairly across crowded cities filled with frightened people would soon prove even more difficult. And as supplies stretched thinner, tensions would rise again. The next phase of survival would not happen in laboratories. It would happen in the streets. The first cities forced to eat the impossible. By the time experimental bread recipes began showing promise, hunger had already tightened its grip on many European cities. The work of scientists and bakers offered hope, but hope alone could not fill empty stomachs. Soon, the moment arrived when theory had to become reality. Entire cities would need to eat what once sounded impossible. In several regions of Switzerland, local authorities faced a decision that carried enormous risk. Grain reserves were nearly gone. Imports had slowed due to bad weather and damaged harvests across neighboring regions. Markets were quiet, and bakeries struggled to keep ovens running. Officials gathered in council halls, surrounded by maps, ledgers, and grim reports. The numbers told a terrifying story. Food supplies could last only weeks, perhaps days. Without immediate action, starvation would spread beyond control. It was during these emergency meetings that leaders approved the widespread production of substitute bread. Loaves made with mixtures of flour, plant fibers, and finely sifted mineral dust. For the first time, the experimental formulas developed in laboratories would be used on a citywide scale. The announcement shocked many citizens. Rumors spread quickly through crowded streets. The government planned to feed people bread mixed with stone. Some believed the news was exaggerated. Others feared poisoning or illness. Trust was fragile, and yet hunger was stronger than doubt. The first city bakeries, chosen for large-scale production, were carefully selected. Officials worked closely with experienced bakers who understood how to control ovens, knead dough properly, and maintain consistent quality. One such effort took place in the city of Zurich. Like many urban centers at the time, Zurich depended heavily on grain shipments from surrounding farms. When those farms failed, the city found itself dangerously exposed. Early one morning, before the sun rose, workers gathered in a central bakery building. Sacks of ordinary flour stood beside new sacks filled with gray mineral powder and dried plant material. The ingredients looked unfamiliar together. Flour had always been the heart of bread. Now, it shared space with substances once considered useless. The bakers worked slowly at first. Measurements were taken carefully. Too much dust could ruin the dough. Too little would not extend supplies enough to matter. Water was added gradually. The mixture thickened into dough, slightly darker than normal. When kneaded, it felt heavier and less elastic than traditional bread dough. Still, it held together. This was the first sign of success. The dough was divided into loaves and placed into heated ovens. Workers watched closely, adjusting heat levels as needed. Baking times were extended slightly to ensure the mixture cooked thoroughly. The smell that filled the bakery was familiar, warm, slightly sweet, though faintly different from the rich scent of ordinary bread. Hours later, the first batch emerged. The loaves were darker and denser than traditional bread. Their crusts appeared rougher, but they were recognizable as bread. Edible bread. That alone marked a victory. Officials gathered to examine the loaves. Some sliced pieces carefully, studying the interior texture. Others tasted small portions, chewing slowly as they evaluated flavor and consistency. The bread tasted unusual heavier and less soft than traditional loaves, but it did not taste like stone. It tasted like survival. Word spread quickly throughout the city. Crowds gathered outside bakeries, watching as the first shipments were prepared for public distribution. Fear mixed with curiosity. Would this bread keep them alive or make them sick? The first public distribution was handled cautiously. Families received small portions at first, enough to test the bread's safety. Instructions were provided on how to store and consume it properly. Officials monitored reactions closely. Doctors remained on standby, ready to treat any illness that might appear. To the relief of many, the first days passed without major health problems. The bread was not perfect. Some people reported stomach discomfort. Others complained about the taste. But it provided nourishment, and that mattered most. As days passed, confidence slowly grew. Soon, bakeries in neighboring towns followed the example. Across parts of Germany, city leaders began adopting similar programs. Local chemists shared recipes refined through earlier experiments. Bakers adjusted mixtures based on available materials. Different regions developed slightly different formulas. Some relied more heavily on plant fibers, using crushed roots or dried vegetables. Others emphasized mineral dust as a primary extender. In certain towns, authorities also introduced ration cards, early systems designed to control food distribution. Each household received a set amount of bread per week, carefully calculated to stretch supplies as long as possible. This system reduced chaos in marketplaces. Instead of fighting for bread, families lined up at assigned times. Guards maintained order. Supplies were recorded and tracked carefully. Though tension remained, riots became less frequent in areas where substitute bread was available. Still, resistance persisted. In the city of Bern, protests erupted when substitute bread was first introduced. Some citizens believed officials were experimenting on them without proper testing. Crowds gathered in public squares, demanding traditional bread. But traditional bread no longer existed in sufficient quantities. Officials responded by organizing public tastings. Community leaders, respected figures such as teachers and clergy, were invited to sample the bread openly. Their approval reassured many citizens. Slowly, acceptance spread. Meanwhile, in other parts of Europe, hunger deepened into tragedy. In regions where substitute bread programs were slower to develop, starvation claimed lives. Reports from rural villages described abandoned farms, empty fields, and families forced to leave homes in search of food. Some migrants reached cities that had already adopted experimental bread systems. There, they found limited relief, small rations that provided just enough nourishment to continue. Urban populations changed rapidly. Shelters expanded. Temporary housing appeared in courtyards and along city walls. Communities learned to share resources in ways never required before. Through it all, the strange bread continued flowing from ovens. Its production required enormous effort. Mineral dust had to be collected, cleaned, and sifted. Plant materials needed drying and grinding. Flour reserves had to be measured carefully to avoid waste. Every step demanded precision. Mistakes could mean hunger or worse. Yet, despite the challenges, the system worked. Not perfectly, not comfortably, but effectively enough to slow starvation. By mid-year, more cities began adopting similar programs. Information traveled through letters, newspapers, and government reports. Each successful case encouraged others to follow. The idea that once sounded impossible, eating bread mixed with stone, was becoming a shared reality across parts of Europe. Children born during these years grew up knowing the taste of substitute bread as normal. For them, survival food became daily life, and while the skis remained uncertain and harvests unpredictable, one truth became clear. Cities that adapted survived. Cities that refused risked collapse. The strange mixture of flour, plants, and mineral dust had become more than an experiment. It had become a lifeline. Yet as production expanded, new challenges emerged. Some regions began running low on the very materials needed to produce substitute bread. Others struggled to maintain fairness in distribution. Black markets appeared, selling ordinary flour at impossibly high prices. Hunger had not disappeared. It had simply changed shape. And in the shadows of crowded cities, a new question began to rise. How long could this fragile system hold together? Because survival today did not guarantee survival tomorrow. The skis still held their secrets, and the harvest had yet to recover. The black markets, smugglers, and secret bread wars. As substitute bread programs spread across struggling cities, survival became possible, but not equal. Even in times of crisis, access to food often depended on wealth, connections, and luck. And wherever scarcity exists, black markets soon follow. By the late months following the failed harvests, strict rationing systems had become common in cities across Switzerland, Germany, and parts of France. Families lined up at distribution centers, handing over ration cards in exchange for measured portions of substitute bread. Each loaf represented survival for another day, but not everyone followed the rules. In wealthy neighborhoods, rumors spread of hidden supplies, private storehouses filled with untouched flour. Some merchants secretly withheld grain from public distribution, waiting for prices to rise even higher. Food, once an everyday necessity, had become a powerful form of currency. In crowded alleyways and dimly lit warehouses, underground trade networks began forming. Smugglers transported sacks of real flour through back roads and hidden river routes. These secret shipments avoided official checkpoints and government inspectors. The reward was enormous profit. A single sack of pure wheat flour could sell for several times its original value, sometimes enough to support a family for months. But the risks were just as high. Governments aware of these illegal trades, began enforcing strict punishments. Anyone caught hoarding grain or selling flour outside official channels faced heavy fines or imprisonment. Still, the trade continued. Hunger creates desperation, but so does opportunity. In cities like Paris, authorities discovered hidden flour caches beneath shops and private homes. Some were buried underground. Others were concealed behind false walls or beneath floorboards. Public anger flared when these discoveries became known. Ordinary citizens, already forced to eat substitute bread, felt betrayed by those secretly hoarding traditional flour. Crowds gathered outside accused merchants' homes, shouting accusations and demanding punishment. Some incidents turned violent. Windows shattered. Storefronts were looted. In extreme cases, entire buildings were attacked by mobs convinced that justice had been denied. Officials responded with tighter controls. Grain shipments were now escorted by armed guards. Warehouses were locked and monitored day and night. City gates were inspected carefully to prevent smuggling. Yet smugglers adapted quickly. They used smaller wagons to avoid suspicion. Some disguised flour sacks beneath layers of firewood or vegetables. Others transported grain by river under cover of darkness. Even rural communities became involved. Farmers who still possessed limited grain reserves faced difficult choices. Selling to official markets meant following strict price controls. Selling secretly offered higher profits, but carried severe legal risks. Many chose secrecy. These underground trades became known in some areas as bread wars. Not battles fought with weapons, but with secrecy, deception, and survival instincts. Meanwhile, substitute bread remained the primary lifeline for most citizens. Though it kept people alive, it was far from ideal. The mineral dust mixtures stretched flour supplies, but they did not provide the same strength or satisfaction as traditional bread. People noticed the difference. Workers reported fatigue more often. Children appeared thinner. Doctors began documenting health concerns linked to prolonged reliance on substitute foods. Not starvation, but slow weakening. This created new urgency among scientists and officials. Improving substitute bread became just as important as producing it. In laboratories across Germany, chemists continued refining recipes. They experimented with adding small amounts of legumes, seeds, and dried vegetables to increase nutritional value. Some formulas worked better than others. One promising method involved grinding dried peas into fine powder and mixing it with flour and mineral dust. This added protein, a nutrient essential for muscle strength and growth. Another method focused on improving taste. Flavor mattered more than many officials realized. Bread that tasted unpleasant led to reduced consumption, especially among children. Some families traded portions away or discarded them entirely. To address this, bakers experimented with herbs and natural flavorings. Even small improvements in taste increased acceptance. Meanwhile, enforcement against black markets intensified. In the city of Vienna, authorities created inspection teams tasked with searching markets and storage facilities. These teams checked weights, measured grain stocks, and verified ration records. Corruption, however, became another hidden threat. Some inspectors accepted bribes in exchange for ignoring illegal supplies. Others manipulated records to benefit certain merchants. In times of scarcity, trust becomes fragile and easily broken. Governments responded by rotating officials frequently, preventing long-term alliances between inspectors and traders. Still, black markets remained resilient. Across river routes connecting parts of France and Italy, smugglers created elaborate networks. Boats moved silently along waterways at night, carrying small but valuable loads of grain. Sometimes, entire communities cooperated in secrecy. Villagers watched for patrols, signaling smugglers with lantern lights when routes were safe. Families shared information about hidden trails and safe storage locations. Survival required cooperation, but also secrecy. Meanwhile, tension between cities and countryside grew stronger. Urban populations depended heavily on rural grain production. When farmers withheld supplies or sold secretly, city officials accused them of betrayal. Farmers, in turn, accused governments of unfair pricing and excessive control. Trust between regions weakened. In certain areas, disputes escalated into physical conflict. Grain wagons were seized by local militias. Farmers defended fields against government agents attempting to enforce quotas. Food had become more than sustenance. It had become power. And amid this chaos, substitute bread continued serving as the fragile bridge between survival and starvation. Its production expanded steadily. New mills were built to grind plant materials and mineral dust. Storage facilities were constructed to hold substitute ingredients safely. Bakers received training on proper mixing techniques to avoid contamination or waste. These improvements increased efficiency, but they also revealed another challenge. Resources were not unlimited. Certain mineral deposits began showing signs of depletion as demand increased. Collecting fine dust required labor and time. Transporting it to cities added further strain on already stressed systems. Officials began tracking supplies carefully, creating detailed inventories of substitute ingredients. Conservation became essential. Nothing could be wasted. Even crumbs of bread were saved and reused in soups or stews. Families learned new cooking methods designed to maximize every portion. Children grew up understanding the value of food in ways earlier generations had never imagined. Meanwhile, outside city walls, the natural world continued its slow recovery. Weather patterns remained unpredictable, but small signs of improvement appeared in some regions. Slightly warmer days encouraged cautious optimism among farmers. Seeds were planted once again, though with uncertainty. Hope returned carefully, never fully, but enough to keep effort alive. Back in the cities, daily life had transformed completely. Markets once filled with colorful produce now displayed limited goods. Public kitchens distributed meals to the poorest citizens. Churches and community groups organized relief efforts, sharing resources wherever possible. Through it all, the shadow economy of black markets continued shaping survival. Some families relied entirely on official rations. Others survived through secret purchases. A few managed both. Inequality widened, but survival remained the shared goal. And despite the tension, one truth became impossible to ignore. Without substitute bread, without the strange practice of mixing dust into food, many cities would already have collapsed. Yet the struggle was far from over, because even as food systems stabilized, new dangers began emerging. Dangers not from hunger alone, but from health itself. The next challenge would test the limits of human endurance in an entirely different way. When cities learned to rebuild their food systems, as the hidden health crisis unfolded, city leaders and communities faced a new challenge. Survival alone was not enough. They had to rebuild food systems in ways that could endure future shocks, ensuring that people received both enough calories and adequate nutrition. Lessons learned during the emergency shaped the approach. Officials realized that merely rationing bread, even with mineral dust, was a temporary solution. To prevent future disasters, cities needed a more resilient infrastructure, one that combined local production, efficient distribution, and innovation. In cities like Zurich and Munich, urban gardens became a critical part of survival strategy. Vacant lots, courtyards, and even rooftops were converted into small vegetable plots. Citizens grew leafy greens, root vegetables, and legumes, crops that could thrive in short or unpredictable summers. These gardens were more than a source of nutrition. They became a symbol of communal effort. Families worked together, sharing seeds, tools, and labor. The sense of collective responsibility reinforced social cohesion at a time when tension had threatened to tear communities apart. Farmers in rural areas were also supported to recover. Governments provided seeds and livestock when possible. They experimented with crop rotation and soil enrichment to improve yields. Minerals found in rock flour, previously used in emergency bread, were now tested as soil supplements. By enhancing the soil with trace elements, farmers hoped to improve future harvests, preventing shortages before they could occur. The city of Vienna became a model for coordinated efforts. Officials organized community kitchens that combined substitute bread with fresh vegetables and legumes from gardens. Nutritionists, a new profession emerging from the crisis, advised on combining ingredients for maximum health benefits. Children and laborers received priority portions, ensuring that the most vulnerable populations did not fall behind. Supply chains were restructured. Rather than relying solely on distant farms, cities encouraged local production wherever possible. Millers, bakers, and farmers were connected directly to municipal authorities to reduce hoarding and black market influence. Checkpoints monitored grain movement, but transparency replaced secrecy as trust slowly rebuilt between governments and citizens. Education also played a role. Citizens were taught how to make substitute bread more nutritious at home, using locally available ingredients. Recipes incorporated legumes, seeds, and small amounts of fats. Families learned how to extend limited flour supplies safely, a skill that would persist even after the crisis ended. The experience spurred innovation in food storage. Authorities began using airtight containers and stone-lined granaries to prevent spoilage. Drying and preserving vegetables became standard practice. Communities that had once relied solely on immediate consumption now embraced methods to extend food longevity. Trade routes were carefully restored. Merchants worked with governments to import grain and other essential ingredients, but distribution was managed to prevent the inequities and shortages that had fueled black markets. Price controls were adjusted gradually to reflect scarcity without allowing exploitation. Perhaps most importantly, the crisis changed public perception of food itself. Citizens began valuing variety and nutrition alongside quantity. The mineral dust bread that had once been ridiculed became a symbol of human ingenuity, a reminder that survival sometimes required embracing the impossible. By the end of the recovery period, cities that had embraced these strategies were stronger than before. Hunger had forced innovation, cooperation, and foresight. Communities developed resilience that would help them withstand future crises, whether caused by bad weather, war, or economic disruption. The survival strategies pioneered during the year without a summer would influence food policy for decades. Governments began to understand the importance of stockpiling essential grains, monitoring nutrition, and maintaining local production alongside imports. Lessons learned from mixing mineral dust into bread informed later experiments with enriched and fortified foods, laying the groundwork for modern approaches to emergency nutrition. And as harvests slowly returned to normal, the strange gray loaves that had once saved cities became a historical memory, a testament to human creativity in the face of desperation. Cities had learned a critical lesson. Survival is not merely about existing. It is about adapting systems to protect life and health, even under the harshest conditions. the psychological impact of survival foods, while substitute bread and innovative food systems saved bodies from starvation. Another battle quietly unfolded inside the minds of those who survived. Hunger is not just a physical sensation, it leaves deep psychological scars, and the experience of eating dust bread was no exception. For many, the first taste of mineral-enriched loaves was shocking. The dense texture, slightly gritty feel, and unusual flavor created a mental barrier as strong as the physical challenge. Some adults initially refused the bread, preferring to risk hunger rather than consume what they perceived as unnatural. Children, however, were more adaptable, though their preference for sweet or soft foods meant the new loaves were often met with complaints and dissatisfaction. Psychologists of the time, though not yet recognized as a formal profession, observed that food perception influenced morale and behavior. Communities that accepted substitute bread quickly experienced lower social tension. Those that resisted experienced more public unrest and conflict. Hunger combined with distrust could spark riots, even when food was technically available. Families developed rituals around survival foods. Baking at home, when possible, became a way to reclaim control. Mothers and fathers added herbs, mashed roots, or small amounts of milk to improve taste. Sharing loaves between neighbors strengthened social bonds and helped normalize the experience of eating what once seemed inedible. In schools and orphanages, teachers noticed that children who received consistent rations of substitute bread displayed improved focus and energy compared to peers who relied on inconsistent or black market food. The brain, starved of reliable nutrition, responded rapidly when even minimal sustenance was provided. This reinforced the idea that survival food was more than just calories. It was a lifeline for mental resilience. Yet psychological challenges persisted. Adults often reported feelings of shame or humiliation associated with consuming survival bread. The dense, gray loaves reminded them of poverty and helplessness. Some refused to eat publicly, sneaking portions at home. Others sold or traded their rations in black markets, seeking to reclaim dignity or comfort in small ways. For communities, the shared experience of eating dust bread became a cultural touchstone. Songs, stories, and local sayings emerged, blending humor and endurance. People joked about stone loaves or gray bread, using humor to cope with the grim reality. Laughter became a subtle but powerful tool against despair. Interestingly, the survival experience also reshaped taste preferences for decades. Children raised on mineral-enriched bread often developed a tolerance for denser, less sweet foods, which influenced regional cuisine and family recipes long after the crisis ended. In some cities, psychologists and physicians later noted post-traumatic effects. Those who had relied on substitute bread during formative years sometimes experienced anxiety around food scarcity well into adulthood. the memory of near starvation left lasting impressions on decision-making, saving habits, and community behavior. Beyond individuals, the psychological impact extended to governance. Authorities recognized that public morale was critical to maintaining social order, providing consistent, transparent information about rations, involving community leaders in distribution, and demonstrating the safety of survival foods helped stabilize populations. Where governments failed to communicate effectively, fear and unrest increased, even when food supplies were technically adequate. Ultimately, the psychological lesson was clear. Survival depends not only on calories, but also on perception, trust, and communal resilience. The strange, gray loaves of dust bread were as much a test of human mental endurance as they were of physical survival. The experience demonstrated that food is never just food. It is a symbol of security, ingenuity, and the fragile balance between fear and hope. Communities that recognized this balance fared better, not only surviving the immediate famine, but also rebuilding with stronger social cohesion and a renewed understanding of human resilience. Innovation beyond bread, other survival foods, while mineral-enriched bread was the cornerstone of famine survival. It was not the only innovation keeping people alive. Necessity, after all, drives creativity, and desperate times led communities across Europe to experiment with a wide array of unconventional foods. In Scandinavia, families revived old traditions of using tree bark, particularly from pine and birch trees, as a filler for flour. The inner bark, carefully dried and powdered, could be mixed with a small portion of grain to extend loaves. Though the taste was bitter and the texture rough, bark bread provided fiber and trace nutrients that otherwise would have been missing. Elsewhere, peasants turned to wild plants that had once been considered weeds. Dandelion leaves, chickweed, and nettles were gathered from fields, boiled, and incorporated into soups or stews. Some botanists helped by identifying edible species and warning against toxic lookalikes, creating early guides to wild food for survival purposes. In mountainous regions like the Switzerland Alps, communities experimented with fermented foods. Fermentation extended the shelf life of vegetables, added flavor, and introduced small amounts of probiotics, which improved digestion at a time when diets were otherwise limited. Cabbage, root vegetables, and even berries were preserved using these methods, supplementing the heavy mineral-based bread. Proteins, which were scarce due to failed crops and livestock losses, were sought in unusual sources. Small fish from rivers and lakes were dried or salted to last through the harsh months. In some areas, insects like crickets or beetle larvae were incorporated into flour mixtures, a practice that, while culturally unfamiliar, provided essential protein. Children often resisted these additions at first, but survival instincts and creative cooking gradually normalized them. Legumes became a focus for nutritionists and bakers alike. Peas, beans, and lentils were dried and ground to a fine powder, then incorporated into bread and porridge. These mixtures offered a crucial source of protein and fiber, offsetting some of the deficiencies inherent in mineral-enriched bread. Recipes were carefully refined to ensure digestibility, as large amounts of legumes could cause digestive distress if not prepared properly. Communities also developed emergency soups that combined whatever ingredients were available: grains, bark, dried leaves, roots, and small amounts of animal protein when obtainable. These soups, thick and gray like the dust bread, became a lifeline for many families. They were easy to prepare in large batches and could be shared in communal kitchens, reducing the strain on individual households. Even in urban areas, rooftop and backyard gardens contributed to innovation. Citizens experimented with fast-growing vegetables such as radishes, spinach, and kale. These crops could be harvested quickly and often produced multiple yields in a single season. By supplementing survival bread with fresh vegetables, families gradually improved nutrition and taste. The crisis also encouraged experimentation with preservation techniques. Smoking, drying, and fermenting became essential practices. Herbs and spices were used not only for flavor, but also for their antimicrobial properties, which helped prevent spoilage. Communities that mastered these techniques were better prepared for subsequent years of poor harvests. Interestingly, the use of mineral dust itself extended beyond bread. In some regions, powdered stone was added to soups and porridges to provide trace minerals. While it did not provide calories, the added nutrients helped maintain bone strength, support blood health, and improve general resilience in a population already weakened by famine. The variety of survival foods reflected the ingenuity and adaptability of human societies under extreme stress. Communities that embraced experimentation and shared knowledge fared significantly better than those that clung to tradition or resisted innovation. By the end of the crisis, a new understanding had emerged. Survival depended not on a single food source, but on diversity, creativity, and willingness to adapt. Bread made from dust had been the first solution, but it was the combination of multiple survival strategies that ultimately saved lives. The period of famine left a lasting legacy in culinary traditions. Some survival recipes persisted for decades, forming the basis of regional dishes, while others became stories of ingenuity passed down through generations. People learned that even the most unlikely ingredients could become lifelines in times of extreme hardship. The role of community and cooperation in survival, while innovative foods and rationing systems were critical to survival, they alone could not save cities from starvation. Equally important was the social fabric. The networks of cooperation, trust, and shared responsibility that allowed communities to endure months of scarcity. In cities like Zurich, community organizations played a vital role. Neighborhood councils coordinated food distribution, ensuring that the most vulnerable children, the elderly, and the sick received priority access to substitute bread and other survival foods. Volunteers maintained lists of families in need and organized delivery systems for those unable to reach distribution centers. Public kitchens became hubs of community resilience. Families pooled resources, contributing whatever ingredients they had to create shared meals. These kitchens often used bulk preparation techniques, stretching meager supplies to feed larger numbers while maintaining nutritional value. Here, people not only received food, but also emotional support, reinforcing bonds of solidarity in the face of adversity. Trust was essential. Without clear communication and fair systems, desperation could quickly turn neighbor against neighbor. City officials realized that transparency, sharing information about ration sizes, ingredient sources, and baking schedules, reduced fear and prevented hoarding. Open communication also discouraged the growth of black markets, which had previously undermined social cohesion. Rural communities demonstrated another form of cooperation. Farmers who still had limited grain or livestock shared portions with neighboring villages in exchange for labor, services, or future support. Bartering systems emerged, linking towns and cities through mutual aid rather than money alone. These networks provided essential flexibility when currency and official trade routes faltered. Children also participated in community survival efforts. Older children helped in bakeries, gardens, and kitchens, learning vital skills while contributing to family and community welfare. Their involvement not only lightened adult workloads, but also instilled a sense of responsibility and resilience that would shape the next generation. Religious institutions often facilitated cooperation. Churches and monasteries distributed food, organized volunteer networks, and provided shelter for those displaced by famine. Clergy worked alongside civic leaders to maintain calm, encourage sharing, and provide guidance on ethical dilemmas arising from extreme scarcity. In some regions, citizens developed informal neighborhood patrols to protect supplies from theft and monitor ration fairness. These self-regulating groups reduced conflict and reinforced social norms, showing that community enforcement could complement official measures. Psychologically, cooperation had a profound effect. Shared responsibility reduced anxiety, built morale, and fostered a sense of purpose. People who felt part of a collective effort were more willing to accept survival foods, endure hardships, and adapt to unconventional diets like dust-enriched bread. Cooperation also encouraged innovation. Community groups experimented with gardening techniques, preservation methods, and alternative food sources, sharing successes and failures openly. Recipes for improved bread, nutrient-rich soups, and edible plants spread rapidly through networks of neighbors, schools, and public kitchens. Ultimately, survival was as much a social achievement as a technological one. Cities that fostered cooperation, transparency, and shared responsibility fared far better than those where isolation, distrust, or inequality dominated. Even in areas with the same level of food scarcity, cohesive communities were more resilient and experienced lower mortality rates. The experience demonstrated a critical truth. Humans are social creatures, and survival in extreme crises depends on collective action as much as individual ingenuity. Dust bread, bark loaves, and emergency soups were crucial, but they were most effective when combined with networks of cooperation that ensured fair distribution, maintained morale, and reinforced trust. In essence, the crisis reshaped society itself. Communities learned that survival depended not solely on resources, but on relationships, empathy, and shared responsibility. Lessons that would influence urban planning, public policy, and disaster preparedness for generations to come. The long-term legacy of dust, bread on nutrition, and food policy. The era of dust-enriched bread left an enduring mark far beyond the immediate survival of famine-stricken cities. Its lessons shaped nutrition science, food policy, and emergency preparedness for decades to come. Scientists and policymakers began to recognize that food scarcity was not merely a temporary inconvenience, but a systemic vulnerability. The innovation of mixing mineral dust, plant fibers, and legumes into bread demonstrated that humans could engineer solutions to extend supplies while still providing essential nutrients. This insight laid the groundwork for future research into fortified foods and emergency rations. In urban planning and public health, authorities prioritized the creation of stockpiles and strategic reserves. Governments established warehouses of grain, legumes, and preserved vegetables, designed to buffer populations against future crop failures or economic disruptions. The logic was simple: prevent crises before they escalated into mass starvation. Nutrition science also advanced. The challenges of sustaining populations on mineral-enriched bread highlighted deficiencies in vitamins, protein, and fat. Scientists began systematically studying the human nutritional needs during emergencies, leading to the development of fortified flours, vitamin-enriched foods, and later, emergency rations for soldiers and disaster relief efforts. Culinary traditions absorbed the lessons as well. Recipes developed during the crisis: bark bread, legume-enriched loaves, vegetable soups, persisted in regional cuisines. These survival foods, once despised, became cultural touchstones, reminding future generations of resilience, ingenuity, and adaptability. Schools sometimes included practical food education, teaching children how to stretch ingredients and prepare nutritious meals in times of scarcity. Food distribution systems were permanently restructured. Cities recognized the importance of combining centralized oversight with local production. Urban gardens, community kitchens, and cooperative networks became integral to municipal planning. Even after normal harvests returned, these systems provided insurance against future shortages and strengthened social cohesion. The crisis also influenced economic policy. Price controls, rationing, and regulation of essential commodities became accepted tools for governments facing scarcity. While controversial, these measures proved crucial in stabilizing populations and preventing social unrest. Lessons learned from black markets and hoarding informed later policies designed to balance free markets with public safety during emergencies. Psychologically, the experience left a generational imprint. People who lived through the dust bread era developed a deep awareness of food scarcity, often saving portions, valuing nutrition, and emphasizing community cooperation. This mindset influenced social behaviors, including charitable giving, communal farming projects, and preparedness for future crises. In international contexts, the success of survival strategies prompted cross-border collaboration. Knowledge of dust bread and other survival foods spread across Europe, informing policies in regions that had yet to experience famine directly. Governments, scientists, and aid organizations exchanged ideas on rationing, nutrition, and emergency food production. A precursor to modern humanitarian response systems. By the mid-19th century, emergency nutrition and urban planning had been permanently reshaped. Dust bread had demonstrated that, even in the face of near-total crop failure, human ingenuity, science, and cooperation could prevent mass mortality. Its legacy lived on not as a dietary staple, but as a blueprint for survival, resilience, and proactive food policy. Ultimately, dust bread symbolized more than sustenance. It represented humanity's capacity to adapt to impossible circumstances, to innovate under pressure, and to transform desperation into structured, long-term solutions. The lessons learned would echo through future famines, wars, and natural disasters, guiding societies in managing the delicate balance between scarcity, health, and social stability. Next asterisk, Part 12, Reflections. How eating dust shaped a resilient future asterisk. Say asterisk 12 when you're ready. Reflections. How eating dust shaped a resilient future. By the time the immediate crisis ended, Europe had experienced one of the most extraordinary examples of human ingenuity and adaptability. The strange gray loaves, once feared and mocked, had saved countless lives and left an enduring imprint on society, culture, and public policy. Survival had depended on much more than food. It had required science, experimentation, community cooperation, and a willingness to embrace the seemingly impossible. Cities that had adopted mineral-enriched bread alongside other emergency foods survived. Cities that delayed or resisted often faced devastating consequences. The experience reshaped urban life. Local food production became a priority, from rooftop and backyard gardens to community-run vegetable plots. Urban kitchens and cooperative networks became institutionalized, ensuring that knowledge gained during famine could be preserved and applied in future emergencies. Nutrition science advanced rapidly as a result. Doctors and scientists had observed firsthand how deficiencies in protein, fats, and vitamins affected populations. These lessons informed the creation of fortified foods, more balanced rations, and emergency nutrition programs that would be deployed in wars, economic crises, and natural disasters for generations. Psychologically, the legacy of survival foods left a deep mark. People who had eaten dust bread developed resilience, adaptability, and a collective understanding of the value of food. Children learned early the importance of community, sharing, and resourcefulness. Adults carried the memory of near starvation, shaping behaviors around saving, rationing, and preparing for the unexpected. Culturally, dust bread became a symbol of endurance and human creativity. Songs, stories, and even culinary traditions commemorated the strange loaves that had once kept people alive. Regional dishes, inspired by survival recipes, persisted for decades, reminding future generations of the crisis and the lessons it imparted. From a policy perspective, governments embraced proactive strategies to prevent recurrence. Stockpiling, regulation of essential goods, coordinated distribution, and early warning systems became cornerstones of urban planning. Black markets, smuggling, and hoarding were no longer seen as minor issues, but as serious risks requiring organized response and oversight. The crisis also reinforced the power of community. Survival had been impossible without cooperation. Neighbors sharing rations, communities pooling labor, volunteers supporting the vulnerable, and local leaders ensuring fairness. Trust and solidarity proved as vital as calories, reinforcing a fundamental truth. Resilience is built not only on resources, but on relationships. Ultimately, the story of dust bread is a story of hope. It shows that even in the darkest times, humans can innovate, adapt, and survive against overwhelming odds. The gray, gritty loaves were not just food. They were a lifeline, a lesson, and a legacy. Cities emerged from famine wiser, stronger, and more prepared. Science, policy, and social cohesion had been tested under extreme conditions, and the results demonstrated that resilience is not accidental. It is deliberately cultivated through ingenuity, cooperation, and the courage to eat the impossible. The strange bread that once saved Europe may no longer fill ovens today, but its lessons endure. Survival is possible when human creativity, determination, and community come together. Even when the world seems to offer nothing but dust,